I wanted to start out by just talking about real world minimal APIs in a kind of special sense. You'll notice that I have real world in quotes here because minimal APIs, if we're honest with ourselves, were really released 3 days ago, right? They came out with .NET 6, and .NET 6 was finally released 3 days ago. So I'm going to talk about some ideas that I'm floating around about how to structure minimal APIs in a larger sense, more than the demos we're typically seeing. But by no means is this the right way or the best practice. I don't think we know what the best practice is. I think that's an evolving thing that as people build larger and larger code sets with minimal APIs, we're going to get a sense of what the right ideas are. So let's kind of go through that. Um, I'm going on the assumption that most people watching have already seen the great talks on minimal API. So I'm going to sort of skip the how to and more talk about how we would really use them. And when we look at minimal APIs in .NET 6, there's a huge gap. There's a huge difference between the way minimal APIs work and the controller-based APIs that many of us have written for years now. And for me, minimal APIs really make sense in the microservices as you're prototyping or doing proof of concept sort of projects because it helps you get up to speed with the pieces. But controller APIs, I still think are really viable when you have APIs that are complex and need things like versioning and in-depth sort of authentication or authorization. Like minimal APIs are great when the use case is somewhat simple, but as you start to glom on these other pieces, which are supported in minimal APIs, it becomes a little muddy. The simplistic model we have becomes a little more ugly. So, as I talked about, there's no real best practices yet. I have been sort of digging into ways we can sort of bridge that gap between minimal APIs and something that's more structured that we might even refactor into controller-based APIs at some point if we really need them. So, as I already mentioned, we're experimenting now, and I don't think anyone in the community knows the exact right way. Um, I do like that minimal APIs give you the control to structure in any way you want. And this is one of the places where they're fairly different from controller based APIs. Controller based APIs have a convention for how they work. It's going to look up classes that end in controller. And if they derive from the right class and it looks like an API, it's going to be treated like an API. And minimal APIs are going to give you more control over sort of the way you decide to architect and structure them. But that doesn't mean over complicating it is going to be a good idea. We all have seen code that was over engineered, trying to be maybe smarter than the code really needed. And minimal APIs can go from simple to over engineered. And so I think that's something as a community we're going to want to look at. So enough of my two big slides. Let's actually look at some code. Because of the short um, length of this talk, I'm going to be showing you code in a couple of different branches. I'm not going to be writing the code by hand, but I'll attempt to sort of walk through what's happening. And I will make this code available on GitHub, and I can point you to that. So I'm using a Visual Studio Code to do this. This would be the same in Visual Studio as well, or Visual Studio for Mac or Writer or whatever tools you're using. But this is kind of where we normally start when we look at the new way to build APIs. This is that program.cs that's going to start our ASP.NET project. We are creating an application. We're adding some services we need. In this case, I'm adding a repository and a database. And then I can start, once the build happens, just start writing APIs. And I've just written 5 APIs here to handle the get many, get one, create, update, and delete, right? Pretty typical CRUD scenario for the kinds of things we want to do. And already we're not talking about huge, but you can imagine if you had more than one entity. I only have this idea of clients right now, that this could get a lot more complicated. And most of the sort of glue here is in other places, like in in the repository is where all the really mapping happens, and knowing what the shape of those queries are. Most of this is just glue code in many ways. And so um, my fear is that we're going to end up with a program.cs that top level statements was meant to simplify, so we could really see what the whole setting up of this of the web server was, and we're going to morph it into this enormous 10,000 line. Every API gets their own line. They're not structured in any way. Maybe they're alphabetized, and that's going to get real headache. And we also don't have good sort of naming here. Just map get, and this is really defining what the operation we're looking at. If we look at get plus this, and is that easy to sort of um, interrogate? Will new developers be able to make a good sense of finding these in the right place? And so immediately I started to think about sort of the structure of it. And so kind of my first pass was, let's clean up the program.cs and do a little refactoring. And that came to this sort of idea. This is the first step branch I'm working in. And this is where I centralize register services. And then I decided to start building a class for each type of API, in this case for the client, that I want to register. And I'm just using um, and passing in the app builder so that I can handle them there. And so, at my first glance, was like, this should work pretty well. We've got these different map calls, and then we're using methods instead of lambdas or arrow functions here to implement each of these. And this is a little better. I can kind of see when I look at the structure of the class here exactly what is involved. But I'm still not in love with it, and I'm not in love with it because we're really depending on this injection happening at every call, and that may not be as efficient, especially if you end up chaining API calls on the server, knowing which you end up in the case where, let's say, a get needs to call a post underneath, or probably the reverse, a post calling a get. We'll need to know the all the dependencies here in order to call get, especially if it's on another controller. And so it becomes a little less integrated when you're talking about more complicated APIs. And so let's sort of take a step back there and go to what I think is at least a good first draft. Let's stash and check out. Yeah. And where I sort of settled is at least a first shot. Oh, we got into get hell, didn't we? Let's reject all of this. I'll fix these later. Cannot believe that in the middle of a talk that I got this all set. Well, this won't run, but let's just talk about it. I'm doing something similar with register services, and I have my services down here, and then I want to configure the middleware. And let's talk about sort of this again, first draft. The first draft was, I'm going to add the services to the dependency injection layer so that I can use dependency injection for what I want. And these APIs are really classes that implement an interface I have called IAPI that just has a register function. That's all we're doing there. But we're able to use injection of dependencies into the actual methods that minimal API is supplying, but we're also allowing ourselves to have API level injection as well if we need it. Like in this case, having a logger class that some of the methods use when they're actually having problems and want to log those problems becomes a use case. Because this is a big difference between how the controller APIs work in the minimal, and that is all dependencies are at the API level, at the individual call level. And sometimes there can be a benefit of actually changing that and moving it to and having them at a class level so you can have a little bit better organization. And then in program, in order to register these, I'm just using the get services for IAPIs that I've registered. And certainly I could have done this by looking for IAPIs using reflection as well. I don't have to necessarily register them all. And then what am I doing? If I find the APIs, then I go ahead and call register with the app and I go about my business, so that it tends to get us closer to that create a class and it just works that I'm used to in MVC APIs, right? In web APIs and ASP.NET Core. But this begs a question. As we start to structure our applications in this special way, are we gaining much benefit over just going to controllers? And that is, I think, an open question. There's still, I think, great benefit for actually having controllers in some cases. The ability to have a client API, know about the route that all of these are going to use, so you don't end up clumping unrelated APIs together, so that one class exemplifies some path to your API. That to me is very attractive. And we could certainly build this, but at some point, will our projects that we start with a minimal API become controller-based APIs? And I think the answer is probably yes. But to me, at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is I can now start a project. Let's say I'm building a React or a Vue or an Angular app, and I want to be able to have some data, maybe even dummy data, exposed to me pretty quickly so that I can focus on that client side development and come back to the server side later. Minimal APIs represent a great use for that. Or if you're building microservices where you have these endpoints that are really just responsible for some part of your domain, and you're going to have a handful of those, you're not going to have much cross contamination because you've chosen that architecture style. Minimal APIs work really well as well. My fear is with minimal APIs that the community at large is going to see minimal APIs as the new right way to do everything. And I really think we need to look at it as another tool that will help us build the right applications at the right time. So that when the cost of the ceremony is higher than the benefit of the complexity, that minimal APIs make sense. But at some point, that complexity becomes large enough that the cost of the ceremony becomes worth it. And that's really where I sit is I think we're going to have all of these options. This is sort of an extension of this whole idea that the right kind of API is what you need to be building. That a lot of organizations, instead of being all REST with minimal APIs, might have some minimal APIs, might have some controller-based APIs, might also have gRPC over here, and might have other sorts of APIs that are sitting out there, OData and et cetera, that meet different needs for development. And the less I think we're stuck into the rigidity of this is the wrong or the right way, or I get asked constantly, what is the best practice for that? And my answer usually is there one? Like, do we need a best practice? Every organization is different enough that it's not as simple as that. And I finished way sooner than I would. So maybe we can jump into any questions that are happening out there on Twitter. I don't know whether Brady and company can help me field those questions, or whether I should go look at Twitter myself. Well, that's not a good look. So let me see if I can jump out into Twitterville and see what I can find out. Hopefully there won't be anything too egregious here.
Are we looking for questions again?
We are. I ended way early. I planned for such a short talk that I made it too concise.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. I'm actually looking at the Twitter as well. We have not had any questions fed to our tag board at this time, but I would encourage the community, if they do have any questions, to go ahead and send them our way here. I'm looking over here as well. Some of the other minimal things.
Well, We'll see if questions come in. I did want to mention a couple of the things about the way that minimum APIs work, and let me talk about that since we're waiting for more questions.
Sure, go ahead.
Awesome.
Go ahead.
So one of the ideas behind the way that minimal APIs work that I find very interesting is there's a lot of magic being done in trying to figure out what your set of parameters here really mean. Because if you just supply one parameter, it's going to kind of expect it to be a HTTP status. So if we look at here, I'm just going to create one real quick just so I can sort of talk
Sure.
about it since we have a minute. And I'll say map get and foo bar. Because this is one of the things that I think is confusing some people is that this, when you're only supplying one parameter and you're not typing it, it can't really infer anything until it defaults back to it being an HTTP context where you're going to handle all of the code from scratch. And this really changes when you then say something like Juris repository, right? Repo. And it now can go, oh, what I think you're really going to want is one of those. And so I'm going to go to the service collection instead of giving you that status. So this using typed parameters here ends up being super important, but also hopefully more documenting. Just like we saw in some of these, even though I'm using concrete types instead of anonymous functions, we're getting that same behavior. It's knowing that when this is called, that these are the things I need to fulfill that request. In the case of get all, there's nothing, but in the case of some of these others, I need to be supplied an ID or whatever. And if you look at the last one I'll mention is sort of the post, is that unlike controller-based APIs that have been getting better and better at this, you never need to worry about telling it where you're getting this client from. It's going to see whether it has a body or whether it's a form encoded or whether it's query encoded and do the right thing to try to form this mapping for you. So how are we looking in questions? I cannot be being that clear or controversial.
No, you're not being that controversial. We've had a few folks who have concurred with you. Oh, here we go. It finally popped up, so this is good. Let me go ahead and add this back to the stream here. So you do have a couple of questions.
Awesome.
We had some. Doug says the minimal API talk is exactly the questions I have from yesterday's talk. So he wanted to thank you for clearing up some of those questions. So that's
awesome.
been good. And then here we have one from Andrea P. You want to read that one?
Yeah. So Andrea says, if I have a web app with more than one controller, each of them with some API, do you think it's verbose to register them all in minimal API? What are your thoughts on that, Shawn?
Well, I think the benefit of having a couple of these, client classes using minimal API has the benefit of organization. And if you only have 2 or 3 APIs, this organization doesn't buy you anything. And creating them all like we did initially in program is fine. It's when you have, half a dozen to, in some cases, hundreds of APIs that some complex projects have, that this organization helps not only the runtime behavior, but in many cases, more importantly, the development, making it discoverable to other developers as to new developers on the project, or being able to find where that code is. Because you can imagine that if every single call to an API is in program, that's going to become harder to manage. And of course, merging between updates and all of that becomes more complex as well. And so a lot of this that I'm sort of implying as a way to think about this is much more about organizational than trying to eke out every cycle of performance. Because I still live in that world where 90 cents out of every dollar that's spent in development is maintaining code, not writing code.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks for clearing that up. That definitely resonates.
And we got one more from our good buddy, Steve. He asked Shawn Wildermuth thoughts on one endpoint profile instead of many in program CS or controller and client API.cs file. Seems to follow more SRP more easily, as well as few merge conflicts, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that I'm in the sort of CRUD world more than I am in some of the other patterns that are out there. But ultimately, organization to me, whether that's in a controller or in something like I'm doing with the API classes here, is almost all about taking those parts of your domain and splitting them up into these groupings that make sense, so that they can be interactable. So interestingly, the same thought experiment of creating a microservice is the same that you would do if you're creating a monolith, if you want to be able to support it well, right?
Got it.
Having those boundaries between the services and having the services that don't have boundaries because they have to interact is a part of that planning project. Whether that ends up being standalone containers inside of a Kubernetes, or it's running on hardware in somebody's closet, it's the same problem.
Got it. What are your thoughts, just as coming from the team? Just one question for you. We've talked to a lot of folks who've enjoyed kind of getting started, or like, and discovering how to build APIs with this kind of approach. From your experience, do you feel like this gives developers a good way to kind of get started and dive in, and then migrate into the controller or the more richer type of implementations? Is that something that you feel people will be able to do gracefully, or do you think that transition will be more difficult?
No, I think this certainly makes things simpler, and I think this is one of the reasons why this pattern has been popular for a long time. It's new to Microsoft's .NET, but this has actually been around. There have been projects for years. Java had Sinatra, which became Nancy in .NET. I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, and there's now a follow-on project that does something similar. It's a little different than the way minimal APIs. And so there's always been a benefit of this simple approach, especially for learners, to go, okay, they're going to want something from me. I'm going to write some code and return that to me without having to understand, it has to be in a class, and this is what an attribute is, and it's going to, like, all of that stuff, I think will certainly um, um, uh, speed up learning how APIs work, and maybe even help people understand them in a more, this is how HTTP works, which is ultimately, I think, the goal there. At some point, for complex projects, being able to move or mature up into controllers, I still think is a laudable case. Though not every project needs that level of complexity, and having an option out of the box that is more simple for smaller projects, I think, is a win for everyone.
Got it. I tend to agree with you, and I think that might be the spirit of what Marshall's saying. The minimal API thing is cool. Likes how concise they are. Great job, everybody. What kind of performance can we see? You've really talked about that a lot, and how it's less about a performance thing and more about a maintenance thing over time. Having lots of code, in different files and whatnot. We've already talked about how .NET 6 is the fastest .NET, so you do know you're going to get good performance out of this. But I was wondering if you had any other thoughts on this as well. If you'd seen anything else to the contrary.
Well, my understanding, I haven't done the numbers, but my understanding about how this has been implemented is this should be faster than controllers, because it's literally going through fewer layers. But the real reality is it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter because the 99% of the speed of your API isn't in getting to your code, it's your code, right?
Right.
And so when someone's like, oh, I want it to be as fast as possible, then why are you calling 6 databases inside? The plumbing code to get to your code maybe is a cycle faster that no one's ever going to notice, and it's about the efficiency of your code in almost every case.
Mhm.
And so while technically faster, I don't think pragmatically the difference matters.
Right.
Mm.
That makes sense. Awesome.